Hi everyone, thank you for giving me the opportunity to give you share some of my experiences in implementing zero-based budgeting. I'm nowhere near a thought leader as Larry is, but I have the advantage of having implemented it in Kraft Heinz in one of the regions, which is quite an interesting, very interesting experience. And it taught me a lot about ZBB as a method, but also as a strategy, really. And the way to look at ZBB is not just to read kind of the budgeting word, because that's not really what it is about. If you want to make a really big difference in organizational performance, you need to think of it as a part of a wider management system and really a culture change for the organization. And the key elements of that kind of culture change are really to have a detailed view on cost, and everyone in the organization have that kind of constant awareness of cost. Key to ZBB success will be ambitious targets and a lot of governance and focus on achieving those targets. And the only way to achieve those targets and kind of keep that focus on top of governance is to make it a key metric in your performance system, in your bonus or your variable compensation schemes, which in Heinz it was very much a key element. And the last thing is more about consistency. Sometimes see there's one rule for people deeper in the organization, another rule for execs, and in Heinz at the time, this is a couple of years ago, these rules were implemented pretty evenly across all management layers. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you need to think, if you want to implement zero-based budgeting and have a real impact, there's a couple of items that you need to take into account. I mean, many organizations, and Heinz was similar before ZBB, kind of deal with some of the problems you see there on the left on your screen, where it's very hard to get a good view on costs and the cost drivers behind it, and any possibilities to reduce costs. And the two main kind of key basics you need to establish or achieve is standardization of costs. Group them in standard buckets with common drivers, and you need to do that across the whole organization, or the whole scope of where you implement zero-based budgeting. The typical way to do that is packages and sub-packages, but there's probably other items. And you need to think about your standardized reports. You cannot have different reports and add them up across the globe. You need to have the same way of looking at costs in a standard way. And to be able to achieve this standardization, you need to have visibility. Detailed visibility, and not using Excel spreadsheets. I mean, we tried that in the first year in Heinz, which was absolutely horrible while we were developing a tool. You need to have some kind of a system where you can pull from the ledgers so that your costs really reconciles ultimately to what your P&L is. Next slide, please. So the next thing to think about is how you will kind of set this up organizationally. And an interesting concept in ZBB is that every dollar of spend is actually owned by two people. So normally you would have a marketing director or sales director. They have a budget for the year on expenses. And if they underspend on people, they might overspend on travel or the other way around. And no one cares too much. That's not the case in ZBB, because you would have a package owner that only looks at travel across all the budgets and says, hang on a minute, you can't overspend your travel because then I am off my targets because I only look at travel. And this double accountability on spend drives a bit of organizational conflict, but also a lot of scrutiny, which drives savings inevitably. And that's kind of what you see in the item to the left of your screen, how that works. A couple of other key principles is to really think about who spends money. I mean, Heinz, we reduced worldwide people who can raise POs by 80%, I think. So the only few people that can do it, know the rules, are trained, and are much more empowered to kind of stop spend when they think it's not right. We changed a lot of workflows. Package owners kind of have to approve spending their package, etc. We had ZBB teams in every business unit, every region, headquarters. So there is some additional headcount here, but many people do this on top of their day job. And then in terms of governance, we had ZBB front and center of any governance, and we had a quarterly review with the CEO of the company, a full day, where he basically reviews all the packages region by region, which is good kind of in terms of visibility, but it's a fairly challenging, because obviously you don't want to go to your CEO and show big overspend first year budget in your targets. Next slide, please. So why would you do ZBB? I think the first one is really to get better visibility on costs and cost drivers, which helps with transparency, because I think we all are aware of compliance as well. So if you know where the costs go, that helps a lot. And then obviously to save costs and control costs. And one big benefit of ZBB is that you get to a point where everyone knows a number. And that's quite an asset, I think. In terms of outcomes, I mean, we saw in Kraft Heinz reductions of more than 30%, some packages up to 60% over 2 years. So really big savings, and you can see that impact on profit margins. I mean, you could of course reinvest it as well, but if you look at Kraft Heinz's profit margins versus a lot of their competitors, they're still fairly significantly higher, and ZBB is a big part of that. And of course, you can choose to invest it in marketing, drop to the bottom line, or pay it in variable compensation, however you want. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways. So obviously, we only covered kind of the surface, right? So I mean, do reach out on LinkedIn on the questions on more specific items. But if you're thinking about implementing ZBB, you kind of need to think of that cultural shift. Is that what the organization wants to do? But it should be a conscious decision, really. And that whole cultural shift is a shift of ownership. If it was your business, would you spend it? That's kind of the key question that comes back to you every time again. And if you want to have sustainable results, so everyone who does ZBB, you can probably get some results in the short term. The more low-hanging fruits or phase spend, or just cut discretionary spend like training, etc. But if you want to have long-term results, I think you can't do some of it. It needs to be kind of a strategic decision to do that. You need to get people along with you, because communication and messaging will be key, because people don't necessarily like it, right? And I think and Dawn has a couple of points in her presentation around how she managed to get over that lump. And equally, management needs to walk the talk. You cannot force everyone to do a certain activity that saves costs and then not do it yourself. I think you need to balance between the enthusiasm of driving a lot of cost out in a very short term with kind of the longer term strategy. So I think ZBB is not good in itself. It needs to be part of a wider strategy. For example, what will you do with the money that's freed up? Finally, looking forward, I think if you think into the future, I think there's a couple of things to be excited about around ZBB. So it's a very labor-intensive program. So if we can use technology to make it a more continuous process, that would be great. And of course, data gives us so much more options to benchmark and e-source and use predictive analysis, etc. Especially the benchmarking is quite cool, because if you can benchmark with a lot of other organizations, you can really understand where your cost base is versus where it should be. I think the last thing is around visualization, to like Tableau and all these kind of items can give a lot of visibility of costs